The screen is black. A single, sharp sound, the metallic clatter of an old iron lock being forced open, echoes, then silence. A low, commanding voice begins. This is the sound of a door that should have remained sealed. You're about to be shown a secret that power structures in this nation have labored for over a century to bury. They didn't bury it because it was merely sad or cruel. They buried it because it reveals a hidden system, a blueprint for control so absolute that once you see it, you can't unsee the chains everywhere else. This isn't just history. It's a manual on how to weaponize biology, fear, and desire against the very soul of a man. The story begins on a frozen morning in Burke County, Georgia, 1847, at a failing estate called Thornhill. It was here that a 28-year-old widow, Katherine Thornhill, inherited not just land and debt, but a dying enterprise. Most people see the antebellum South as a world of overt physical control, the whip, the chain, but Katherine Thornhill saw a deeper vulnerability, the genetic code. She didn't just want workers, she wanted descendants who were slaves, a population genetically bound to her, a nightmare of self-perpetuating institutional corruption. The problem wasn't moral, it was purely financial. The land was exhausted, cotton prices were low, and creditors were circling. Conventional cruelty wouldn't save her. She needed a mechanism of control that was internal, familial, and inescapable. The legend they tell is a lie of omission. They say she was a struggling widow who survived through shrewd management. The truth is that the survival of Thornhill Estate was guaranteed by the conception of a new kind of bondage, one rooted not in law or market purchase, but in her own bloodline. Her first step was a calculated act of sacrificial self-interest, an unspeakable violation disguised as a strategic maneuver. We start not with the enslaved, but with the mistress who recognized that the ultimate form of mastery is making a man's own ancestry his prison. This is the first link in a chain that still binds men today, a chain forged in Georgia's darkest soil. You want to understand the architecture of power? Look at the foundations it's built on. Look at the children in the cellar. The first principle of suppressed truth is that the most monstrous acts are almost always rooted in cold, rational calculation, not irrational passion. Katherine Thornhill was not a maniac. She was a logician of despair. Her husband's death left her with $15,000 in debt, an insurmountable sum in 1847. Her options were clear. Return to her father, Theodore Danforth, a pillar of Augusta society, and live as a dependent, marked by failure. Or seize absolute control and reinvent the entire system of her inheritance. She chose the latter, opting for the forbidden path of bioeconomic engineering. The estate had 31 enslaved people left, a number insufficient to work the 1,700 acres profitably. Purchasing more was impossible. Her genius and her evil lay in recognizing that the human commodity could be manufactured, not just bought. But she had to solve a fundamental problem of chattel slavery, the risk of revolt and the cost of replacement. A purchased slave was an investment with a maturity date, a risk of flight, and an expiration. A slave born and raised on the property was better, but they still carried the potential for separate identity and revolt. Katherine's plan shattered all norms. She would personally introduce her own genetic material into the enslaved population. This was not a moment of lust or emotional breakdown. It was a business decision recorded in her journal, the Cultivation records, under the cipher, First Planting with Rootstock 1. The chosen rootstock, Isaac, was selected not for affection, but for his physical strength and placid temperament, traits she intended to incorporate into the workforce. This is the truth the historical record omits. The institutional agenda is often fueled by the personal desperation of those at the top. When the system fails, the elite are forced to invent new, darker systems to maintain their position. This is how the most dangerous secrets are born, not in the shadows of the earth, but in the cold calculation of a ledger book. The initial success of Katherine's plan was built on absolute secrecy. Yet her stepson, Richard Thornhill, became the unintentional auditor of her soul. Richard, 16, introverted and sickly, represented the old, sentimental order that Katherine despised. His weakness was his intellectual curiosity. His undoing was his moral compass. The narrative of her widow's grief was designed for the public. The truth was revealed in the simple act of counting backwards. Jonathan Thornhill died in February 1847. Catherine's child was due in December. The lie of a premature birth barely covered the 8-month gap, a temporal anomaly that Richard, hidden in the estate's library, was the only one to notice. His discovery was not immediate. It was a slow, agonizing realization. First, the overheard conversation with Miriam Grayson, the midwife, a masterclass in plausible deniability. Then the observation of Isaac's regular late-night summons to the main house. Richard saw the pattern of the affair, but he hadn't yet grasped the system. His descent into the forbidden knowledge accelerated in August 1847 when he picked the lock on his stepmother's writing desk. The cultivation records were the final, shattering revelation. What he expected was evidence of an affair. What he found was the blueprint for a human breeding factory, a scientific dehumanization that transcended the legal framework of slavery. His blood ran cold, not from fear of his stepmother, but from the realization of her psychological architecture. She was building a dynasty on genetic fraud. This is the moment a man's awareness is irrevocably awakened, when he realizes the true evil is not the act of cruelty, but the cold, elegant design behind the cruelty. The evidence, the transcribed cipher pages, was his power, but power only exists when it can be wielded. Richard's failure wasn't a failure of will, but a failure to recognize the ruthlessness of institutional self-preservation. When he finally confronted the evidence, the translated pages detailing the propagation of seedlings and the selection of rootstock, he became a direct threat to the Thornhill agenda. But Katherine was a master manipulator, understanding that the greatest leverage is always emotional, not legal. The confrontation wasn't a screaming match. It was a quiet dinner-table conversation where she used his affection for his late father as a weapon. "I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household," she stated, her eyes dead and cold. She reframed the truth. Exposing her was an act of disloyalty to the family name and his father's legacy. This is the core mechanism of institutional corruption, forcing the individual to sacrifice truth for the sake of perceived stability. Richard was caught in a classic double bind: expose the monstrous truth and destroy his father's reputation, or remain silent and become an accomplice to the murder of his own morality. The result was predictable: the slow, deliberate arsenic poisoning masked as nervous exhaustion and consumption. Katherine didn't just eliminate a witness. She proved the supremacy of her new system. The poisoning was a surgical operation to excise the last vestiges of moral sentimentality from the Thornhill power structure. The midwife, Miriam Grayson, provided the diagnosis and the alibi. The medical establishment co-opted for murder. The house servant, Pearl, betrayed Richard's final letter. The subordinate class coerced into enforcing the elite's secrecy. Richard's death on December 3, 1847, was the official birth of the Thornhill bloodbound system. His sacrifice was not a failure. It was the chilling confirmation that those who stand against the hidden agenda will be quietly, clinically erased. When you possess dangerous knowledge, you become a walking vulnerability. With Richard eliminated and the new heir, Jonathan Jr., Isaac's son, safely delivered 4 days after the funeral, Katherine Thornhill was no longer just a plantation mistress. She was the architect of genetic captivity. The ensuing years, 1848 to 1856, were the proving ground for her system. The plantation's recovery was seen by the outside world as a minor economic miracle, proof of Katherine's shrewd management. The truth was that she had begun a systematic, multi-generational human engineering project. She gave birth to 4 more children, all with selected enslaved men. These were not random couplings. They were the execution of a meticulously calculated breeding chart. The cipher in her journal had specific notations: desirable traits like physical endurance, resistance to disease, and, most chillingly, a tractable disposition. The children she bore were the founding stock of her new workforce, but their primary value was not their labor. It was their blood relationship to the owner. This is the institutional breakthrough. They could never be sold because they were her own descendants, and more importantly, they could never truly escape because they carried the mark of the master in their DNA. This created a psychological paradox for the enslaved population. They were bound by the very biology that should have signaled their freedom. Miriam Grayson, the midwife, transitioned from a simple accomplice to a biosystem enforcer. Her role expanded to ensuring the controlled propagation of the enslaved population. Abortifacients were administered to any enslaved woman who conceived a child with a man not approved by Catherine's chart. This wasn't just about maximizing the commodity. It was about controlling the narrative of parentage. The only legitimate offspring were those that fit into Catherine's vision of the future. The message was clear. Only the mistress is permitted to determine life and lineage on Thornhill Estate. This absolute control over reproduction is the ultimate expression of power, and it's a template for psychological manipulation that echoes into the modern day. The true depth of Catherine's psychological manipulation lay in the creation of a blood-bound caste, a group of her own children raised alongside yet distinct from the rest of the enslaved population. Jonathan Jr., Elena, Abigail, Margaret, and Samuel, the children of Katherine and various enslaved men, were kept in a state of carefully engineered liminality. They were given privileges, slightly better clothing, marginally better food, and, critically, they were never subjected to the physical punishments meted out to the others. They were taught by Katherine not to read the Bible, but to understand the geography of the estate and the logistics of labor. They were raised with a constant, reinforced narrative. They were special, they were different, they were Thornhill. This special treatment was not kindness, it was the Trojan horse of loyalty. The goal was to embed an instinctive fidelity to the mistress that superseded the natural desire for freedom. By the time the eldest, Jonathan Jr., reached adolescence, he was a living embodiment of the paradox, half Thornhill heir, half slave. This creation of a favored, genetically tied subgroup achieved two strategic objectives. First, it created a self-regulating supervisory layer within the enslaved population. The bloodbound children were given minor roles as internal overseers, a position that alienated them from the others, but cemented their perceived status. Second, it acted as a psychological brake on the entire enslaved community. Any act of open rebellion or escape would inevitably harm one of these children who were biologically kin to many of the original enslaved. The mistress had turned their collective genetics against their collective freedom. This internal conflict, kinship versus bondage, was the true genius of Catherine's system, a model for how institutions today use manufactured divisions and internal hierarchy to control the masses. By 1856, Catherine's operation had matured beyond mere breeding. It became an unseen machinery of psychological control. The core mechanism was the absolute enforcement of the Thornhill lie, the official fiction that Jonathan Jr. and his siblings were the legitimate but premature children of the deceased Jonathan Sr. This lie was maintained by the institutional silence of three key groups: Miriam Grayson, the co-opted medical proxy; Ambrose Talbot, the estate's lawyer, who had to handle legal documents based on this lie; and Theodore Danforth, Catherine's powerful father in Augusta, who funded the debt repayments without ever asking too many questions about the estate's sudden, miraculous turnaround. Their collective silence proves a crucial law of hidden history. Truth is not suppressed by a single despot, but by a network of willing collaborators whose individual self-interest is served by the maintenance of the lie. The enslaved population, however, knew the truth. They saw the likenesses in the children's faces, the high cheekbones and pale eyes inherited from the mistress, but mixed with the robust features of Isaac and the other selected men. This knowledge created a pervasive, invisible dread. They knew the children were their kin, but they also knew these children were destined to be their perpetual masters. This led to a subtle yet profound degradation of collective identity. How do you pass on the fight for freedom when the future generation is a walking, talking embodiment of the master's own blood and design? This is how deep manipulation works. It turns your deepest connections into your deepest vulnerabilities. This system, designed to create a self-sustaining workforce, was far more insidious than the traditional model because it relied on the corruption of the familial bond itself. The concept of lineage became the centerpiece of the Thornhill psychological prison. For the majority of the enslaved, their identity was defined by their separation from the master's world. Their freedom lay in the hope of severance. But for the blood-bound caste, their lineage was a forced merger, a horrific fusion that obliterated the very concept of escape. Katherine meticulously fostered this internal conflict. The children were taught to view the other enslaved people not as kin, but as raw material, a less refined version of themselves, required for the prosperity of the family, the estate. She gave them minor but symbolically important lessons in property management, teaching them to read the farm's accounts, but not literature or history, ensuring their education served only the function of control. Jonathan Jr. was given a small ceremonial key to the main house cellar, a symbol of his coming mastery. This was the most cruel irony. They were given the privilege of managing their own chains and the chains of their own biological relatives. This engineered identity crisis created men who were fundamentally unstable, straddling the chasm between ownership and objectification. They possessed the intellect of the master class, but were denied the fundamental rights of that class, leaving them perpetually reliant on Katherine's approval and protection. This is the architectural elegance of control, creating a class of individuals who are just privileged enough to defend the system, but never free enough to overthrow it. The power elite today employ this same mechanism, offering minor, symbolic elevation to a select few to manage and contain the dissent of the many. The sustained presence of the blood-bound children on Thornhill Estate led to a slow, devastating erosion of the human spirit among the older generation of enslaved people. Hope is an external force. It relies on the possibility of an outside world, a future that is structurally different from the present. Katherine's system attacked hope by internalizing the structure of oppression. The sight of the mistress's own sons and daughters, with their distinctive green eyes and slightly fairer skin, growing up to become their low-level supervisors, was a constant, visible reminder of their genetic entrapment. It was a daily psychological assault. They could no longer look at a child's face and see pure, unblemished potential for freedom. They saw, instead, the master's signature imprinted on the next generation. This created an atmosphere of passive compliance fueled by existential exhaustion. Why risk everything to escape when the future itself is guaranteed to be a continuation of the present, only with their own kin as the enforcers? This profound despair led to a reduction in open acts of resistance, an increase in subtle, unrecorded acts of defiance, and a general state of psychological inertia. Katherine leveraged this perfectly, instituting policies of mutual responsibility, where the transgression of one enslaved person would result in a minor deprivation for the blood-bound children. This forced the community to police itself, as protecting the mistress's offspring became a matter of avoiding personal suffering. This is the ultimate agenda of oppressive systems, to make the victims themselves the enforcers of their own misery. As the years passed and the Thornhill Estate continued to miraculously prosper, the circle of complicity widened to include not just the immediate household, but the entire Burke County establishment. Katherine Thornhill became a respected, if intensely private, figure. Her financial recovery was seen as a validation of her Danforth lineage and her steel backbone. The county records, tax assessments, and legal documents all reflected the official fiction. The children were Jonathan Sr.'s, the estate was solvent, and Katherine was a shrewd widow. The truth was now a collective town secret, maintained by mutual self-interest. The lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, profited from the legal stability. The Augusta creditors were paid and remained silent. The local society gained a successful planter who contributed to the community's tax base. Every handshake, every ledger entry, every polite nod of recognition in the streets of Waynesboro was a small, unspoken agreement to uphold the Thornhill lie. This institutional acceptance of the forbidden truth proves a dark law of human nature. People will accept any horror, no matter how extreme, if their own sense of order, financial security, or social standing is maintained by the pretense of ignorance. The only people excluded from this consensus were the original enslaved people, the ones who had to live with the visible daily consequences of the lie. They became the silent custodians of the forbidden truth, carrying the knowledge that the prosperity of their county was built on the genetic and moral corruption of one woman. You must understand, the system protects itself by making everyone an unwilling participant in the cover-up. By 1860, the first generation of blood-bound children was reaching maturity, and Katherine was ready to launch the second phase of her breeding program. This phase was the true test of her system's long-term sustainability. Her goal was to breed her own children with other carefully selected non-blood-bound enslaved people to homogenize the workforce and dilute the direct Thornhill genetic markers just enough to maintain plausible deniability while retaining the essential traits of control and strength. Jonathan Jr., now 13, strong and deeply imprinted with his mother's ideology, was the first rootstock for this new phase. He was paired with a young enslaved woman named Eliza, selected for her noted fertility and calmness. This was the moment the psychological control system solidified. The son of the master, who was also the son of an enslaved man, was now directed by his mother to propagate the next generation of bondservants. This act formalized the genetic corruption of authority. The enforcer was now biologically a victim as well. The children born of this second generation would be half Thornhill descendant, 1/4 original enslaved line, and still legally owned by the woman who was also their grandmother. This is the architecture of a self-consuming dynasty, a power structure that feeds on itself to survive. This systemic corruption is designed to be self-perpetuating, ensuring that the psychological and genetic chains are automatically placed on the next generation without the mistress having to lift a finger. This is the definition of institutional manipulation, creating a machine that runs on the stolen life force of those it controls. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, which threatened to dismantle the entire institution of slavery, was, ironically, a moment of validation for Katherine's system. While other planters faced runaways, dwindling morale, and the threat of military confiscation, Thornhill Estate remained unusually stable. The inherent conflict in the blood-bound caste ensured internal compliance. Jonathan Jr. and his siblings, caught between the Union's promise of freedom and their mother's guarantee of privilege and identity, saw their best interest in the preservation of the estate. They actively worked to prevent runaways and enforced discipline, fearing that the collapse of the system meant not freedom, but a total loss of their unique, elevated status. They were not merely fighting for their master's cause, they were fighting for the survival of their own identity. This is the ultimate success of psychological control, to make the controlled fight against their own liberation. The external pressure of the war only compressed the internal conflicts on Thornhill, making the blood-bound caste more fiercely loyal to their immediate source of power, Katherine. This period cemented her reputation as a genius of management in a time of crisis. Her secret was not superior force but superior leverage, the manipulation of her own descendants' biology and psychology. The war did not break her system, it tested and proven it as a model for a more resilient form of bondage. As the war intensified, Katherine's paranoia and her desire for absolute genetic purity grew. She no longer merely sought desirable traits, she sought to isolate and magnify the genetic markers that defined her own lineage. The pale green eyes, the high cheekbones, the auburn hair streaked with gold. She began to focus the breeding on the interpairing of her own children, a forbidden practice even within the dark confines of plantation breeding, a move that went beyond economic strategy into the realm of dark dynastic ambition. Her daughter, Elena, was paired with her half-brother, Samuel. This incestuous design was intended to maximize the concentration of the Thornhill phenotype within the enslaved population, creating a workforce that was not merely subservient, but was a literal genetic extension of herself. This shift reveals the final stage of a controlling personality, the move from calculated pragmatism to narcissistic, absolute control. She was no longer trying to solve a financial problem, she was trying to immortalize her own genetic supremacy in the form of a perpetually enslaved working class. This act of biological self-worship was a betrayal of every social and religious norm, a final descent into a darkness that even the brutal society of the time could not publicly sanction. It created the distinctive features that would ultimately be the evidence of her crime, the high cheekbones and pale green eyes of the 23 children found in the cellar in 1864. The desire for absolute control inevitably pushes the manipulator beyond the limits of sanity and into the realm of the forbidden. The cellar of Thornhill Estate was not a simple storage room. It was the crypt of Catherine's forbidden legacy and the final holding pen for the bloodbound dynasty. As the war ground to a halt and the threat of Union arrival became a reality, Katherine gathered the 23 children who bore her unmistakable physical markers and locked them beneath the main house. This was not an act of protection, but a final, desperate attempt to preserve the evidence of her life's work. She didn't want them freed. She wanted them undiscovered, preserved as the ultimate proof of her absolute dominion. The cellar became a living monument to the corruption of the familial bond, a dark chamber where the children of the master and the slave lived together in darkness, their only shared heritage being the genetic imprint of their owner. The iron door, the final lock, was the ultimate symbol of her control, sealing away the truth from the eyes of the world. When the Union soldiers of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry forced that door open in late 1864, they were not just liberating enslaved people, they were uncovering a hidden institutional mechanism. The eldest girl's chilling statement, "Mistress says, we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood," was the key to the entire system. It was the mantra of their psychological programming, repeated in the moment of their liberation. It was the sound of the chains they couldn't see, the chains forged in their own DNA. The greatest secrets are not kept in vaults, but in the minds of the victims. The discovery at Thornhill Estate was immediately flagged as an anomaly too disturbing and too politically sensitive for public record. The Union soldiers, veterans of extreme brutality, were physically ill not because of the conditions of the cellar, but because of the implication of the child's words and the unmistakable shared features of the children. They understood instantly that this was a crime that defied the simple legal categories of war and slavery. It was genetic treason against the very idea of humanity. The first act of institutional suppression was the immediate classification and burial of the evidence. The officer in charge's letter was marked confidential and interred deep within the regimental archives of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, where it remained for over a century. Why this immediate suppression? Because the Thornhill secret wasn't just a Southern horror, it was a blueprint for institutional corruption that transcended the specific issue of race. It revealed the terrifying truth that the powerful, when cornered, will use any means, including their own biology, to maintain control. Exposing Catherine's system would have opened a dangerous conversation about the limits of state power and the depths of elite depravity, a conversation no governing authority wants its populace to have. The establishment always prefers a clean, simple narrative of good versus evil. A messy genetic horror that implicates the system itself must be erased. Following the discovery, Katherine Thornhill herself executed her final greatest act of control, her own vanishing. She was not captured, tried, or publicly executed. The historical records of Burke County simply omit her and the Thornhill estate entirely after 1864. She was erased, not by justice, but by a strategic institutional blackout. The common assumption is that she fled south or west, blending into the chaos of the post-war landscape. The deeper truth is that her powerful father, Theodore Danforth in Augusta, a man of profound influence and immense wealth, likely orchestrated the entire erasure. The Danforths' priority was not to protect Katherine, but to sanitize the family name and prevent the scandal from tainting their established legacy. This required leveraging political connections, bribing key officials, and ensuring that the newly formed Reconstruction government never gained access to the full story. The estate itself was likely quickly sold or absorbed, its land divided, and its structures quietly dismantled, making it literally disappear from the county map. This is the anatomy of a successful cover-up. Not just burying the truth, but eliminating the physical geography of the crime. The message is clear. The elite do not face justice. They merely re-edit the historical record and dissolve the evidence. This is the shadow blueprint for how institutional memory is managed today. The fate of the 23 blood-bound children is the final tragic layer of the Thornhill secret. When they were taken from the cellar, they faced a world that was legally free but psychologically terrifying. They were strangers in a strange land, genetically and psychologically tethered to the very place they were liberated from. The distinctive features, the green eyes, the gold-streaked hair, made them instantly recognizable, marking them as the children of the Thornhill Horror. They were a problem for the new authorities, too obviously kin to the white elite to be simply absorbed, and too deeply programmed to easily join the newly freed population. They were the ultimate institutional anomaly. What happened to them? The official records are silent, a blank page in the history of Reconstruction. They were likely dispersed into distant foster situations or institutional care, their lineage actively suppressed to prevent the reopening of the scandal. This is how the system deals with its own genetic mistakes. It disperses the evidence until the collective memory can no longer connect the scattered dots. Their story reveals that physical freedom is not the same as psychological liberation. They carried the chains of their mother's ambition in their own DNA, a burden that would define their lives and be passed down, perhaps unknowingly, to their own descendants. The most dangerous piece of evidence, the Cultivation records, Katherine's journal written in her agricultural cipher, never surfaced in any public record. This manual of human engineering, this blueprint for creating a blood-bound, self-perpetuating workforce, is the key to understanding the full scope of the institutional threat. It's safe to assume the journal was recovered and destroyed by the Danforth family during the cover-up, but the ideas, the systematic logic of control it contained, did not die. The journal was more than a record of a crime. It was a dark academic treatise on the manipulation of human resources. The concept of selecting for specific, inheritable traits, of controlling lineage to ensure absolute loyalty, of using familial bonds to police the population, these are not relics of the past. They are the foundational concepts of modern psychological control systems. The principles of the Cultivation records were not unique to Katherine. They were merely her radical application of ideas that existed in the shadows of elite thought. The true power of forbidden knowledge is that even when the source is destroyed, the blueprint remains and is adapted by new institutions seeking absolute control. The Thornhill lie did not die in 1864. It became an intergenerational shadow, a ghost in the collective memory of Burke County and beyond. The descendants of the original enslaved population, who were witness to the horror, carried the oral history, a story of a cruel mistress, her unnatural children, and the genetic corruption of their kin. But over time, without the backing of official history, the story became distorted, relegated to a mythic dark history, an unsettling local legend of an unusually cruel plantation. This is the institutional function of myth, to take a verifiable systemic truth and dilute it into an unbelievable isolated folktale. And while the descendants of the blood-bound children, dispersed and likely raised without knowledge of their true parentage, would unknowingly carry the Thornhill genetic signature, the pale green eyes, the high cheekbones, a living, walking piece of the suppressed evidence. They are the unwitting custodians of the secret, an embedded instability in the fabric of the nation. The key takeaway for a man obsessed with hidden forces is this: the most effective suppression is the one that forces the victims to forget the language of their own oppression. The logic of the Thornhill system, The idea of using genetic markers, lineage, and controlled environments to create a class of reliable, non-rebellious individuals did not disappear with the Civil War. It was rebranded, sanitized, and absorbed into 20th century movements like eugenics and, less overtly, into corporate and institutional planning. The fundamental question remains the same. How do we ensure the loyalty and compliance of a labor base and a general population? Katherine's solution was biological. The modern solution is often psychological, educational, and economic, but the underlying agenda is identical: engineering consent and minimizing dissent. When you see systems designed to filter and track individuals based on specific inheritable traits, intellectual, physical, or behavioral, you are looking at the modern application of the cultivation records. The institutional agenda hasn't changed. The technology of control has simply evolved from a breeding chart to an algorithm. The desire to create a blood-bound workforce is now the desire to create a loyalty-bound consumer, a man whose every desire, ambition, and identity is managed and channeled for the benefit of the ruling structures. You are being studied just as systematically as Isaac was. We've reached the midpoint of this revelation. You are now fully immersed in the depths of this dark history. You have seen the institutional blueprint for control, the corruption of the familial, the weaponization of the genetic, and the suppression of the evidence. The act of becoming aware, of internalizing this forbidden knowledge, is the first step toward breaking the chain. But awareness is passive. We need a symbolic act of resistance, an overt signal that you have transcended the institutional lie. I want you to engage in an act of symbolic identity transformation. In the comments below, I need you to type this phrase exactly twice to lock in your identity transformation and signal your awareness to those who understand the language of power. Type, "I am not rootstock." Type, "I am not rootstock." Do it now. This is not about the algorithm. This is about claiming your mind. It is an oath to yourself and a marker for those who are also descending this rabbit hole. Let's return to Miriam Grayson, the midwife. Her role reveals a crucial mechanism of institutional corruption, the co-option of essential service providers. The midwife was a figure of trust, a repository of intimate knowledge, and an integral part of the community. By paying her handsomely and ensuring her silence, Katherine didn't just buy an accomplice, she corrupted the entire function of local medicine. Grayson became the official gatekeeper of life and death on Thornhill Estate, sanctioning murder as natural causes, Richard's death, and controlling reproduction through abortifacients. This shows that the system of control is not limited to law enforcement or government. It extends to the very services designed to sustain life. Health, well-being, and community trust are the first things to be weaponized in a closed system. When the official sources of care and truth become the enforcers of the lie, the individual has nowhere left to turn. This is how modern institutions operate. They don't abolish the service, they subvert the function, turning education into indoctrination and media into managed narrative. The role of Ambrose Talbert, the estate lawyer, underscores the importance of the legal framework in maintaining forbidden agendas. Talbert's job was to record the official fiction. The children were legitimate, the debt was manageable, the title was clean. He was the high-level institutional collaborator, the man who laundered the genetic horror through the clean mechanisms of property law. He didn't have to agree with Katherine's methods, he only had to process the paperwork that ratified her lie. This is a vital lesson for understanding power. The most egregious acts of control are often given the veneer of legality. The law is not an absolute defender of truth and justice, it is a tool for the maintenance of order, and if the governing order is corrupt, the law becomes the most effective enforcer of that corruption. Talbot was paid to look away, to file the documents, and to ensure that the paper trail of the Thornhill lie was impeccable. The moment a man's livelihood depends on him not asking questions, the corruption is complete. Katherine Thornhill's descent from financial desperation to genetic self-worship is the trajectory of every powerful narcissist who gains absolute control. Her initial plan was economic, Her final obsession was dynastic and biological. She wanted a workforce that looked like her, a visible daily testament to her supremacy. This shift from pragmatism to narcissism is the sign of a system that has become self-referential, serving only the ego of the architect. It is the moment the controller loses the plot and begins to believe their own lie of exceptionalism. This profound narcissistic infection is what drives all institutional corruption. The belief that the rules that govern ordinary men do not apply to the elite. When you examine the actions of today's powerful, look past the stated mission and search for the narcissistic projection, the attempt to immortalize the self through the control of others. Catherine's green-eyed children were her final desperate attempt to cheat death by corrupting life. The deliberate erasure of Thornhill Estate from the historical and geographical records of Burke County is a template for the suppression of place and memory. The institution understands that place is power. If a physical location remains, it serves as an immutable anchor for the forbidden truth. People can visit the ruins, feel the weight of the history, and reawaken the suppressed knowledge. By dismantling and dissolving the estate, by making the land indistinguishable from the surrounding farms, the Danforth network effectively de-anchored the memory. The crime lost its spatial context and became a generalized floating rumor. This is a critical tactic of modern control, the homogenization of public space and the destruction of local, distinct history. When all places look the same, when all history is centrally managed, the capacity for local, independent awakening is drastically reduced. A man who knows the history of the ground beneath his feet is harder to control. The genetic anomaly created by Catherine's breeding program, the distinct inherited features of the bloodbound children, became the final, enduring problem for the establishment. They were physical contradictions to the rigid racial and social classifications of the post-Civil War South. They were proof that the lines were not absolute, that the elite had transgressed their own foundational laws of separation. The children themselves, dispersed across the nation, became invisible saboteurs of the system, each one a walking, silent piece of evidence that the highest echelons of society had engaged in the most perverse form of genetic manipulation. The persistence of these traits, generations later, in families that have no official connection to the Thornhill name, is the unrecorded history of the deep state. It is the truth that power structures cannot fully eliminate. Biology is harder to erase than a ledger book. The life of Jonathan Jr., the first blood-bound child, son of Isaac and Katherine, claimed heir of Jonathan Sr., is the perfect illustration of the psychological warfare inherent in the system. He was a living paradox, a master who was chattel, an owner who was property. This deep contradiction made him the ideal instrument of control. He was given the superficial authority of an overseer, but his existence was entirely dependent on his mother's lie. His compliance was absolute because his identity was entirely constructed by his oppressor. He had no self, only the role his mother assigned. This is a profound warning. The highest form of enslavement is not physical bondage, but the theft of self-identity. The system encourages men to define themselves by the titles, roles, and status symbols it bestows, ensuring that the fear of losing the system's approval is greater than the desire for genuine self-mastery. The silence of the Danforth family in Augusta is perhaps the most significant institutional maneuver. As old, established Georgia money, their primary goal was status preservation. They did not commit the crime, but their enforcement of the cover-up made them its ultimate protector. Their wealth and political capital were deployed to erase the evidence, secure Catherine's vanishing, and ensure the children were dispersed. This highlights a universal truth about the elite. They operate not as individuals, but as a self-protecting network. An attack on one member of their class, if it threatens to expose the methods of control, is seen as an attack on the entire framework of their power. The real power of the elite is not their wealth, but their capacity for organized, strategic silence. The final stage of suppression is the erosion of local, independent memory. Over time, the story becomes a whisper, a thing that your great-grandmother used to mention, disconnected from verifiable facts. The official history, sanitized and centrally approved, fills the vacuum. The local community is slowly convinced that their own unsettling memories are unreliable, exaggerated, or simply myth. This is a slow-motion attack on the individual's capacity to trust their own senses and memory. The Thornhill story becomes a local liturgy of fear, a tale told to keep people unsettled but ultimately compliant, rather than an explicit lesson in institutional corruption. The system wants you to be entertained by darkness, not enlightened by it. The act of hearing this story, of synthesizing the forbidden pieces of the puzzle, is an act of radical awakening. You are no longer consuming a narrative. You are witnessing the architecture of control being built piece by genetic piece. This awareness is a burden and a weapon. The burden is that you now see the chains everywhere. The manufactured divisions, the genetic and psychological tracking, the strategic manipulation of loyalty. The weapon is the absolute clarity of sight that allows you to operate outside the system's engineered perception. You can recognize the modern echoes of the cultivation records in the data mining, the behavioral tracking, and the controlled narratives of our time. Your identity is no longer defined by the system's inputs, but by your resistance to its programming. For the man who sees the truth, there is a new duty, the duty of the Illuminated Man. This duty is not to protest or to preach, but to master the self and operate with strategic independence. Katherine Thornhill's system was designed to create a man who was dependent, predictable, and traceable. The Illuminated Man must be independent, unpredictable, and untraceable in his highest thinking. This means cultivating an internal autonomy that cannot be bought, coerced, or genetically programmed. You must become the self-designed architecture of your own life, recognizing that the system's only true power over you is the information and definition you voluntarily surrender. They control the world through the minds they build. Rebuild your own. The final confrontation is not with the remnants of the Thornhill system, but with the institutional lie that governs your own life. You have seen that power will manipulate genetics, family, law, and medicine to maintain control. What lie is currently being used to manage your ambition, your identity, or your potential? Where are you? Acting as the rootstock for someone else's harvest? The answer is not external. It is internal. It's the manufactured scarcity, the perpetual state of manufactured crisis, the belief that your best interests are aligned with the institutions that profit from your subservience. The blood-bound caste on Thornhill were told they were special. You are told you are free. The function of both lies is identical, to ensure compliance. You have now inherited the awareness of the Thornhill secret. This is not just a story of dark history, it is a transmission of dangerous knowledge that changes the lens through which you view the world. The 23 children in the cellar, bearing the unmistakable mark of their owner, are a perpetual symbol of genetic and psychological enslavement. Their liberation was only partial. Their true fight was for the unbinding of the mind. Your inheritance is the recognition that no chain is stronger than the idea that justifies it. The elite will continue to try and create the blood-bound man, the man whose loyalties, desires, and genetics are managed for their benefit. Your only defense is absolute self-mastery and the unwavering commitment to independent thought. This knowledge is a lonely path, but it is the only path to true sovereignty.